We will be back in Genesis, continuing with the life of Joseph this morning. If you have not been here for the first two, I'll give you a quick recap. We are halfway. This is the middle sermon on the life of Joseph. We have two more to go, and then we will be switching to the Gospel of Luke in preparation for Easter. So where are we and how did we get here? We began by talking about how Joseph was betrayed by his brothers. Due to their jealousy, decided to get rid of him, and then graciously decided only to sell him into slavery. Our second message talked about how Joseph found first success and then difficulty in Potiphar's house, how his faithfulness led him to responsibility, and his moral turpitude got him into trouble because of Potiphar's wife. And we left Joseph in jail after our last message. So we're going to be in chapter 40. We have two more to go after this. So beginning in chapter 40 of the book of Genesis, starting in verse 1, it says, "Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, 'Why are your faces so sad today?'" So sometime later, that reminds us that Joseph is still in prison. He is where we left him, even though he's been given great responsibility by the warden, and he evidently has some freedom of movement. He's not confined to a cell because he's going from prisoner to prisoner to see to their needs. In spite of that, he's still in prison, and nobody wants to be there. The question, what's worse than being a slave, could be answered being a slave in prison. So Joseph has gone from bad to worse. And now we hear of Pharaoh's displeasure. Pharaoh is evidently upset with his baker and his cupbearer. And we don't know why. We don't know what they did to earn his displeasure. But one of these men is responsible for much of Pharaoh's food, and the other for his beverage. And it could have been something as simple as a meal that went bad. Sometimes if you have a bad meal and you're the Pharaoh, you feel the need to throw someone in prison. Or it could have been something much more serious. It could have been a plot against Pharaoh's life involving poisoning, in which case these two men would have been on the chopping block. Whatever it was, they are in prison. And we know that autocratic power like that wielded by Pharaoh tends to lead toward paranoia. When you have power like that, you tend to suspect others are trying to take it away from you. And usually those closest are the ones. And they have dreams. They have dreams that are not good dreams. Have you ever had a dream that was so real and so vivid that you weren't sure afterward that it hadn't really happened? And you sat there for a moment wondering what was real and what wasn't. Or perhaps you had a dream in which you woke up shouting or yelling or in a cold sweat because it was so terrifying. It may have, in other people's words, only been a dream, but it certainly seemed real to you. Well, it's one thing to have a pleasant or a weird dream that you just can't make sense of. It's quite another to have one that's disturbing or frightening. And these two men had dreams that offered them glimpses into their future. They were certain of it. These dreams will tell us about the future. But what good is it to know that and not understand it? And so they said there is no one to interpret them. They are dejected because they have no way of knowing. You see, the understanding and interpreting of dreams in the ancient world was a big deal. Most rulers, most people in power had someone or even several people who were in charge of dreams, and visions, and signs, and reading the stars, and all that sort of thing. And this is not the only time that God is going to use that level of superstition on the part of the people in order to elevate one of his own servants. We also remember that Daniel came to the notice of Nebuchadnezzar when he interpreted his dreams. And later on, when he was able to explain Belshazzar's vision to him. So we've seen this before. And so Joseph comes to the forefront, picking it up again in the second half of verse 8. We both had dreams, they answered, but there's no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. And he said to him, in my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand. This is what it means, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up, will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And you will put Pharaoh's cup into his hand just as you used to when you were his cupbearer. Well, but when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried off from the land of Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. Joseph begins by saying, do not all interpretations belong to God? You see, those who sought for an oracle or a mystic to tell them about dreams or visions were going to the wrong place. Wisdom and truth indeed always belong to God. So if a dream is supposed to bear a message to someone, God will make it plain to them. And so Joseph is told the dream, and he interprets it for the cupbearer and says, this is a message of restoration. In 3 days you will be returned to your former position. And all of this imprisonment will have just been like a nightmare. You will wake up from it and it will be over and everything will be okay. But, he says, remember me and show me kindness. You see, Joseph asked the cupbearer to return the favor and to tell Pharaoh about his own unjust punishment. You see, this may be Joseph's only chance to ever walk out of prison. When is he ever going to have the ear of someone who can speak to Pharaoh on his behalf again? Joseph reminds the cupbearer that neither his status as a slave nor his incarceration were deserved. And we ask ourselves, what would it take for Pharaoh to believe Joseph? Well, the first thing it's going to take is courage on the part of the cupbearer. For him to go to Pharaoh and say, excuse me, I know I'm just the cupbearer, but I want to talk to you about a fellow prisoner I met down in prison. There's 2 problems with that. 1, it's awful presumptuous. And 2, it reminds Pharaoh that he put you in prison for a reason just a little bit ago. Maybe you don't want to do that. So it's going to take some courage. But as a foreign slave, accused of a heinous crime against his Egyptian master's wife, it would have taken a miracle to get Joseph out of prison. So hold on to that thought. We'll be back to that. Verses 16 to 19. When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the baskets on my head. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat away your flesh. Well, the baker says, hey, his interpretation was good. I might as well press my luck and find out. But maybe the baker should have thought about his own dream for a moment before realizing it's not going to be a good one. His interpretation is unfortunately negative. It is a message of judgment. Joseph could not offer him encouraging words. He explains to the baker that he has 3 days left to live. Now, I think it's easier on Joseph's part to interpret the first dream than the second. The problem with being someone who interprets dreams is that they don't always come out well. And so now, Joseph is the bearer of bad news, and we often know how that works for the messenger. So what happens? What happens after Joseph explains these 2 dreams, beginning again in verse 20? The 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Now that is an interesting thing to do on your birthday, to have a feast and restore one man to his position and hang the other. I hope not all of us decide to celebrate in such a fashion. But Joseph's interpretation proves to be the true one. The baker is executed, the cupbearer restored. Now we know that Pharaoh would have done what he wanted to do, whatever the dreams had to say. The dreams are simply a way, an opportunity for Joseph to demonstrate his own faith by putting the talent that God gave him to use. And it is also an opportunity for the cupbearer. Let us not forget him. He has an opportunity here to show gratitude for God for this interpretation in this dream, and also for Joseph. But the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. How do you forget somebody like Joseph? How do you forget someone who helped you out of a difficult situation in your life? Wouldn't you hope that you or I would remember someone who had been there for us in a dark and difficult time? How is it that you can forget the people that help you on your way up when you find success? You'd have to be someone who thinks only of yourself and not of others. As we see, I needed to read the first part of 41:1. When 2 full years had passed, that was it. When 2 full years had passed, that tells us how long the cupbearer forgot about Joseph. Talk about a kick in the gut. Joseph must have felt some confidence when he saw the cupbearer and the baker in prison, when they had dreams and he realized, I know a little something about dreams. God has shown me dreams before. I can do something here. It must have felt like providence. Joseph must have been buoyed by that. Have you ever been sure that God was up to something in your life? Oh, God's doing this. I can see the signs. This is happening. It's going to work. Only to be disappointed? That's Joseph right now. God was at work, and now nothing but the crickets for 2 years. Every time Joseph starts to recover from one trouble, a new one finds him. In this case, he had that good report he was expecting, and it never happened. But Joseph doesn't know that. He doesn't even know if the cupbearer told Pharaoh anything. Perhaps Joseph is wondering, my cause really is hopeless. Maybe he did go to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said no, and it's over. Most of us have been there at one time or another, haven't we? Wondering if God is hearing our prayers or not. And beginning to say to ourselves and beginning to feel like the answer must be no, right? It's been so long, the answer must be no in any case. Because why else am I waiting so long? And yet we know that God had not forgotten Joseph. He had not forgotten about his servant even when the cupbearer did. Pick it up again in 41:1b. Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. I don't know how he falls asleep after that. I'm sorry. He fell asleep again. That would probably keep me up all the rest of the night, wouldn't it? He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, stood and were growing on a single stalk. After them 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Pharaoh needs an interpreter because he has had a weird pair of dreams. He has seen 14 cows and 14 heads of grain. Well, he knows that there is something up about this dream, and it seems like they're obviously connected. But the question remains, what are these 2 groups of 7? Why 7? What do the 7 represent? What are the good things and what are the bad things? It's a mystery. He has no idea. And so he sends for the magicians and the wise men throughout the land, anybody who thinks they know what this means. And they know nothing. Because, as you remember, Joseph said to the cupbearer, interpretations belong to God. Now, these men that he sent for may have been talented in faking and understanding of visions or dreams to con the common people out of their possessions. You can make money that way. But to tell Pharaoh something that you know what his dream is, you had better be right. You better be real lucky, because what happens if you tell Pharaoh something about his dream and it turns out to be wrong? You're going to be right next to where the cupbearer and the baker used to be, if you're lucky. So the best thing to do is say, I have no idea, Pharaoh, I'm sorry. Because at least that way you can probably walk back on out of here. And now we got the cupbearer back into the story in verse 9. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And the things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was hanged. And the cupbearer says, oh, my bad. I forgot about this. At least he remembered his debt to Joseph. Now it took 2 years, and it took God smacking him upside the back of the head with Pharaoh's dream and saying, hello, remember? But he did. Here's an interesting tidbit that I noticed here that you may have never noticed. The cupbearer and the baker, where were they held? In the house of the captain of the guard. Who's that? That's Potiphar. They were in Potiphar's house. Joseph went to Potiphar's house to see to their needs. He evidently was held in that complex as well. That must have been a bit awkward, don't you think? To see the servants and the slaves that he had once been in charge of? Maybe to have to make a report to Potiphar about these 2 prisoners? Bit awkward. Once more, he does this. And now, Joseph is remembered. The cupbearer finally tells Pharaoh of his amazing ability to interpret dreams. And with that awkward bit of reminding to his boss, oh yeah, remember, you threw me in prison once, remember? About that time, it's a funny story. He says to Pharaoh, Joseph comes before Pharaoh, verse 14. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I can't do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he deserves. Well, before Joseph can go before Pharaoh, he has to make himself presentable. You see, it's not proper to go before Pharaoh looking like a prison slave, even if that's what you are. You got to clean yourself up. And this is in all likelihood the first time Joseph had ever been clean-shaven. You see, it was the Egyptian custom for the men to shave, but the Hebrews did not. So I'm sure Joseph looked a little bit different afterwards. Keep that in mind, because in the next chapter, his own brothers are going to see him and not recognize him. But they are not expecting him to be this way. Joseph, however, gives God credit up front. It takes both courage and humility to tell the man who has the power to free you, both from prison and from bondage, that you can't help him. That takes a little bit of guts. And yet Joseph has clearly learned to rely upon God in these years of trial and not to resent God. That's the choice. That's the choice he had when his troubles came, when he became a slave, when he was thrown into prison. Do I cling to God even harder through this storm, or do I abandon him now that my troubles have come? And that choice makes all the difference in the world. Joseph remains faithful and true to the Lord. Notice his confidence. It's not all of us who would be able to say to Pharaoh, God will give Pharaoh the answer. He hasn't heard the dream yet, but he has confidence that God will work. An amazing example of his faith, even when his own prayers have gone unanswered all of these years. Joseph remains faithful that God is still with him. And I'm going to skip a little bit in this rest of this chapter so that we can get through it. Verses 25 to 36. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, because Pharaoh's going to repeat the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It's one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterwards are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. There are the 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance of the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. So Joseph interprets his dream, and he says, 7 years of plenty are coming, and then 7 years of famine. He tells Pharaoh plainly that 7 great years will come, but 7 horrible ones are coming right after them. The matter has been firmly decided, he said. God will do it soon. Well, as Joseph, you at least have good news to start with before the bad. It started with the 7 good years before the 7 bad. But Joseph also adds his own wisdom, and I tend to think that this comes from Joseph's mind. He says, you know what? You ought to put somebody smart in charge. Appoint a commissioner over the land. Collect all that extra during the good years so that it will see you through the bad. That seems like a bit of wisdom for all of us, is it not? Save up a little something during the good years in case the bad come. Joseph tells Pharaoh to appoint someone to oversee this huge project, and believe me, it is a big project, so that the kingdom will not be ruined by the famine. Certainly, he's thinking Pharaoh's going to pick his most trusted and wise official, somebody with experience for such a crucial job. But what does Pharaoh do? Pharaoh goes a different tact. And I'm only going to read verses 37 to 40, and then I'll summarize the rest of the chapter. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials, so Pharaoh asked him, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all of this known to you, and there is no one else so discerning and as wise as you shall be in charge of my palace, and all of my people are subject to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Pharaoh accepts God's wisdom. This Pharaoh does. Fast forward 400 years, and Pharaoh of another time gets a message from God and decides to stay against it. And we know how that turned out. But he sees the hand of providence clearly on this young man. And he says to his counselors, who else can we find that is as good and as wise as this man? Why not take advantage of it? The same wisdom that Potiphar showed before. If God is going to bless Joseph, I want in on that. Once again, Joseph's good qualities are combined with God's grace to elevate him from a difficult situation. And now, where is he? He has power, he has authority, he has honor. He will be the second in command to Pharaoh. By the way, that means he's Potiphar's boss. Interesting twist of fate there as well. He's in charge of the whole grain collection project. In addition, we learn later in the chapter that Pharaoh gives him his signet ring to have his authority throughout the land. And he gives him a new Egyptian name, one that we're not familiar with because it was Zaphenath-Paneah. Rolls right off the tongue. He also gives him a high society Egyptian wife, an important man's daughter to be his wife. We learn that Joseph was 30 years old when his ordeal finally ended. Those of you with the math skills, 30 minus 17, he was 13 years a slave and a prisoner, all of which he did nothing for. 13 years of his life. We also learn that he had two sons during those 7 years of abundance, Manasseh and Ephraim. Manasseh's name signified something to Joseph because he said, God has made me forget all of my trouble and all of my family's household. Therein we see that God may have elevated Joseph, but there's still a hole. There's still a hole in his heart because Joseph is a man without a country. He is a man without an extended family. The loss of his brothers and his father is still keenly felt. And then everything happens just as God had revealed to Joseph. 7 years of abundance are followed by 7 years of famine. But Egypt is spared starvation because God blessed the whole kingdom through his one faithful servant, Joseph.